on torture. This is such a horrible subject that I have hesitation in talking about it, but it is extremely important. Now, torture obviously is a word which applies to many things. It's on a continuum, so you can have the most extreme, horrific physical and mental torture at one extreme, and then minor tortures like being in a very hot car in a traffic jam at the other extreme. And it also is on a continuum from physical to mental and moral torture, and there is much torture that doesn't involve any kind of physical abuse. But the kind I will reflect on briefly is physical, although it has the concomitants of fear and mental torture as well. It's a subject which I don't think I thought about much at school, and even much as an undergraduate. It was when I came to write a thesis and then a book on witchcraft in England that I encountered the subject of torture, because one of the obvious features of many witch trials was that torture, physical torture, was applied. The thumb screw, the hanging by your arms, the water tortures, and so on. This, I discovered, was very prevalent, in fact almost universal, in countries with Roman law, that is, continental countries, and in countries influenced by that, Scotland. And the rates of witchcraft were much higher because a person would be taken in as a suspected witch, and then they would be tortured, and they would reveal other people who would be taken in. So you had huge witch finding movements. In England, I discovered torture was not officially allowed. You had things which were sort of quasi-torture, similar to waterboarding today, waterboarding being putting people's head under water until they almost suffocated and then bringing them out, which is apparently horrendous. The equivalent in the 16th, 17th century English trials was that it was believed by some of the judges and others that the witch would have a small creature, a familiar, as it was called, which was the devil, which would come and suck on it, on the lady, usually a woman. And one way of discovering if a person was a witch would be to put them in a room with someone watching through a chink and keep them awake, and because the devil wouldn't come if they were asleep, and watch and see if an imp or a little dog or whatever came in. And by keeping them awake, this is known, if you keep someone awake for very long times, they go into a delirium and it's very horrible. So in many parts of the world where you're not officially torturing people, you just keep them in a small room with the full lights on, and you go in and disturb them every few minutes to make sure they're awake. And after a time, their resistance is reduced. Now, the great difference between the continental and English systems arose from a simple fact in law, which was that in these continental systems, and it also applied to the Soviet Union, Darkness at Noon by Koestler is a wonderful account of the practice of this kind of judicial trial. In these countries, in order to actually pronounce someone guilty and execute them or whatever, they had to confess. Punishment without confession was not allowed. Now, in most cases, they wouldn't confess to begin with, and the same was true in other systems, for example, Ming Dynasty codes in China and so on. You had to get a confession, and the obvious way to get a confession and the reasonable and allowed way to do that was to torture the person, or maybe to threaten that you would torture their families. And so the use of torture of all sorts and kinds, horrible kinds, was to get them to confess. You even see this implicit in George Orwell's account of torture in 1984 with the rats in a cage by someone's ear, someone who hated rats and knew that they would gnaw into his brain. And they wanted his confession, which you want in absolutist states. So absolutism and confession coming back into line, because it's really important for those kinds of societies that if you deviate, you come in back into line before you are executed. Not enough just to get rid of you. It must be shown to other people that you realize the error of your ways and you confess. And that led to these horrific tortures. In England, it was a different legal system. And in England, there was just one requisite, which is that you plead. In other words, you put in a plea that you are either guilty or not guilty. And then you are tried. You can say, I'm not guilty. You don't need to confess. You can plead not guilty. But it was essential that you put in a plea. And the one major form of a kind of torture in England was forcing you to plea. Because again, if you didn't plea, then it was denying the supremacy of law. You were saying this court hasn't got the right to try me, and so I'm going to keep silent. And that wasn't to be allowed. So through medieval times and somewhat onwards, you had, the first thing was you asked what do you plead, and if you refused to plead, then you'd be laid down with a wooden plank on you, and they'd put a fairly heavy weight on you. And the weights were increased. It was called the peine forte et dure, the pain hard and long. And finally, you would plead or you'd be crushed to death. Now that is a kind of torture, but it's not a torture to extort a confession. And most people would be happy to say, I'm not guilty. After that, you weren't allowed to torture. The one exceptional period was in the 16th century when the Star Chamber and one or two high courts for treason, if you were involved in a plot, like Guy Fawkes, to blow up the throne and to cause the whole state to collapse, then certain judges allowed judicial torture to try and find out your accomplices. But when a big and famous trial took place in the 20th century about whether torture was permissible in English law, led by Lord Bingham, Tom Bingham, as a very learned historian and lawyer, he went through all the materials and he came to the conclusion that torture is not permissible in any situation in English law. And this is one of the things that I admire most about English law. Sadly, the admiration is tempered by the fact that it isn't allowed here, though the case was brought because there were some people who wanted to use torture. And other places where Anglo-Saxon customary law has been taken, like America, have deviated. We now know that torture was widespread in American prisoner of war bases, Abu Ghraib and elsewhere, and of a horrific kind. We know that certain very eminent top lawyers in the top universities in America have advocated the use of judicial torture. I won't name names, but there's one who says that you should have torture warrants issued to judges, and they can recommend that judicial torture, and this lawyer recommended the use of putting a splint of wood underneath people's fingernails, which is horrifically painful but doesn't leave any signs. And he explained the philosophy to his students by getting them to imagine a bomber who was threatening to bomb a small village. And would you allow the person, if caught, to be tortured to find out where the bomb was? And most of the students said no. And then he increased it to a large-ish town. No. And then he increased it to a big city. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, would die should you use torture. And by this kind of subtle device, he forced almost all of them to admit that you should use torture in certain situations. Now that seems a horrific kind of legal argument and procedure to even put it to your students in that way. But this top lawyer, who was an advisor to presidents and others, taking the English common law system, thought that you could justify torture. So the movement to retain a world without torture is always under threat. Just takes one new president or one new judge to change it. And so it has to be safeguarded, because personally the thought of being tortured is above all the thing that I fear. I've never ever been anywhere close to it, and I hope I never will be, because I don't know how I would react, and I'm full of admiration for those who are tortured, and full of horror for those regimes and legal systems which allow this bestial, subhuman, inhuman cruelty. But of course, we torture all the time, and it's, if you move your gaze sideways to animals and look at the behavior of all of us, every time I eat a chicken or whatever, I'm half aware that it's probably been produced with a kind of torture which we wouldn't allow for humans in a tiny battery cage, etc., etc. So torture is unfortunately very widespread, but it's something which we have to understand, face, and try to eradicate.